In graph 23.3, we illustrated the case of perfect or first-degree price discrimination, where the monopolist sells each of the goods for exactly the marginal willingness to pay by the consumer who's buying the good. If the good is the kind of good that each consumer consumes only one of, then in essence each consumer is given a separate price for the good that's being produced. But if we have the kind of good that consumers buy multiple units of, perfect price discrimination would mean that consumers are being charged different prices for the first good they buy than for the second and the third and the fourth good. But this seems a little unrealistic. A monopolist might be able to tell whether a consumer is a relatively high demand or a relatively low demand consumer, but if consumers buy multiple units of the good, it's unlikely that the monopolist can charge a different price for each good that is sold to the same consumer. This then gives rise to a second type of price discrimination, known as third-degree price discrimination. Under third-degree price discrimination, the monopolist can tell what kind of consumer she's encountering, but she can only offer goods at a single price to each consumer. She can offer different prices to different consumers, but only the same per unit price to any one consumer. If the monopolist produces the kind of good that each consumer consumes only one of, then this third-degree price discrimination becomes the same as first-degree price discrimination, which we explored in graph 23.3. But if the monopolist produces the kind of good that consumers consume multiple units of, a difference emerges. Suppose that consumers of type 1 are relatively high-demand consumers and can be treated as a separate market from consumers of type 2. Then from the demand curve for consumers of type 1, we can derive the usual marginal revenue curve that's associated with that demand curve. To make things as simple as possible, we'll assume that the marginal cost curve is perfectly horizontal at 10. Treating this as one market that is served by the monopolist, we then again set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue and determine that the producer would produce output quantity X1 and sell it at the monopolist price P1 to consumers of type 1. If the monopolist could perfectly price discriminate, she would sell each unit that's produced at exactly the price right off the demand curve for type 1 consumers. Thus, a type 1 consumer would buy different units at different prices, and the demand curve would become the monopolist's marginal revenue curve. In that case, the monopolist would produce, where marginal cost intersects the demand curve, the quantity of 200. But if the monopolist can only charge a single per unit price to a given type of consumer, she'll charge the price P1 and sell the output quantity X1 to type 1 consumers. Under perfect price discrimination, the monopolist's total revenues would therefore be equal to the entire shaded area, leaving the monopolist with a surplus of the shaded triangle above the green marginal cost curve up to the demand curve. But under third-degree price discrimination, the monopolist's surplus would only be the vertical distance P1 minus 10 times the horizontal distance X1. Consumers of type 1 would be left with no surplus under perfect price discrimination, even though they buy more goods. Whereas under third-degree price discrimination, where consumers of type 1 are charged P1, they are left with the surplus triangle of the area above P1 up to the demand curve. The relatively low-demand consumers of type 2 would then be treated as a separate market by the monopolist, with the demand curve again giving rise to a marginal revenue curve. Since we've assumed a constant marginal cost of 10 for the monopolist, we can again draw a flat marginal cost curve. In the low-demand market, the producer will then set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue to determine the output quantity X2 and charge the price P2 at which that output quantity can be sold to type 2 consumers. If the monopolist could perfectly price discriminate, she would charge prices along the demand curve, making the demand curve in the low demand market equal to the marginal revenue curve in the low demand market, and allowing production of 100 units where marginal costs now intersects marginal revenue. Under perfect price discrimination, total revenue for the monopolist would therefore be the entire shaded area, leaving the monopolist with a surplus of the triangle above the green marginal cost up to the demand curve. But under third-degree price discrimination, the surplus for the monopolist would only be the vertical distance P2 minus 10 times the horizontal distance x2. And again, consumers would get no surplus under perfect price discrimination, but are left with a surplus of the triangle above the price P2 up to the demand curve under third-degree price discrimination. When a third-degree price discriminating monopolist encounters different types of consumers, she will therefore come up with a different per unit price for each type. With constant marginal cost, this implies that each market, the high demand and the low demand market, will be treated as a separate market, as if the monopolist was operating only in that market. Of course, we again need two conditions to be satisfied. First, the monopolist has to be able to tell who's a type 1 and who's a type 2 consumer, and second, the monopolist has to be able to prevent resale so that the type 2 consumers who get a lower price don't buy and then sell to type 1 consumers who get offered a higher price by the monopolist.